It began as a trade war. It could end as a constitutional crisis. Trump's tariffs on steel, aluminum, and China weren't just economic weapons. They may have crossed legal boundaries. And if America's courts strike down a president's trade war, what happens to every deal, every promise, and every precedent set in those turbulent years? To understand this story, let's go back to 2018. Tariffs, once a sleepy policy tool buried in economics textbooks, suddenly exploded into the daily headlines. President Trump declared America was being ripped off by foreign competitors. Steel from China, aluminum from Canada, washing machines from South Korea, solar panels from everywhere. He said it all was a threat. And he acted. Tariffs slapped across entire industries, hundreds of billions of imports taxed at rates not seen in decades. The justification? National security. Trump's team invoked Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. That law gave the president power to restrict imports if they endangered America's defense. But here's the twist. Section 232 wasn't meant for long-term economic battles. It was designed for emergencies, wartime shortages, existential threats to critical supply lines. Trump used it as a blunt force political weapon. And that's where the legal trouble begins. Because when you call Canadian steel a national security threat, you're stretching the law until it snaps. Judges noticed. Tariffs weren't just policy. They were shockwaves through the U.S. economy. Steel prices soared. Automakers and construction firms relying on imported metal saw costs skyrocket. Electronics manufacturers faced delays and layoffs as global supply chains fractured. Farmers, they were dragged into the crossfire. China retaliated with punishing tariffs on soybeans, pork, and corn, hitting rural America right where it hurt.
The White House insisted it was a necessary sacrifice. Short-term pain, long-term gain. Trump promised factories would roar back, that the U.S. would regain its industrial crown. But the reality? Pain stretched on, and the promised gain never fully arrived. Even industries supposedly protected by tariffs, like U.S. Steel, struggled with volatile prices and global retaliation. Behind the scenes, companies filed lawsuits, trade lawyers raised alarms, academics called it executive overreach, and constitutional scholars began asking, had the president just rewritten America's balance of powers? One of the first big challenges came in a case called Trans-Pacific Steel versus United States. Turkish steel had been hit with tariffs double the rate of other countries. Importers cried foul. They sued, claiming discrimination, inconsistency, and abuse of authority. In 2019, a federal judge agreed. The ruling: Trump's move violated constitutional protections of equal treatment under the law. For the first time, a court declared this trade war wasn't just aggressive, it might be unconstitutional. But the government didn't back down. It appealed. Higher courts weighed in with mixed rulings, sometimes shielding the White House, sometimes hinting at clear overreach. The message was muddled, but the crack in the legal foundation was undeniable. If one tariff could be struck down, others might follow. Let's step back. This isn't only about steel or soybeans. At the heart of this fight is power. Does the president have near unlimited authority to declare imports a national security threat? Or is there a constitutional boundary? Remember, the Constitution gave Congress the power to regulate trade. Tariffs, taxes, duties, those were legislative tools. Over the decades, Congress delegated more and more authority to the executive branch. First for efficiency, then for emergencies, and then, slowly, as political convenience.
By 2018, Trump had a tool that few presidents dared to wield so broadly: Section 232. It became his sword. Critics warned, if this stands, any president could label French cheese, German cars, or Japanese electronics a threat and slap tariffs overnight. No debate in Congress, no accountability to voters. That's why judges mattered. Courts weren't just ruling on trade, they were ruling on the limits of presidential power. And the verdicts could reshape America's constitutional balance for decades.
But the courtroom drama was only half the story. On the world stage, the fallout was staggering. Trump's tariffs didn't just target China. They hit Canada, Mexico, Europe, Japan, longtime allies bound by NATO, trade pacts, and decades of shared defense. The irony was painful. Canadian steel used to build US tanks was suddenly labeled a security threat. German cars assembled in US factories by American workers were treated like enemy products. Allies retaliated with surgical precision. Europe hit back with tariffs on bourbon, Harley-Davidsons, and Levi's jeans, symbols of American culture and industries rooted in Trump's political base. The European Union called it betrayal. Canada called it absurd. Diplomats whispered that America had abandoned its own rules. For decades, the US had preached free trade, global rules, and fair play. Now it was tearing up the rule book, and allies wondered, if America breaks the law at home, why would it respect laws abroad? The lawsuits didn't stop. Importers, exporters, manufacturers all lined up in courtrooms. They argued tariffs were arbitrary, rushed, politically motivated. They pointed to studies showing minimal gains, massive costs, and increasingly, they questioned whether Section 232 itself had become unconstitutional, whether Congress had delegated too much power to the presidency. One case after another forced judges into uncomfortable territory. Was it their role to second-guess national security claims? Or did blind deference to the president create a monarchy in disguise?
Some courts sided with Trump, citing precedent. Others carved out exceptions, signaling unease. The legal chessboard grew messy, but one thing became clear. America was now litigating the very definition of presidential authority. And this is where the story darkens. If courts ultimately rule large parts of Trump's trade war illegal, the consequences ripple far beyond tariffs. Every deal struck under those tariffs could be questioned. Every retaliatory measure could be challenged. Every ally burned could argue the US acted outside its own law. It wouldn't just be an economic reversal, it would be a constitutional crisis, a direct collision between presidential power, congressional authority, and judicial oversight. And the stakes are enormous. Because if courts set strict limits, future presidents will be handcuffed in using national security as a cover for economic battles. But if courts let it stand, the door is wide open for unchecked executive power in trade. Either way, America's credibility, at home and abroad, is on trial, and the verdict could reshape not only Trump's legacy, but the very meaning of checks and balances in the 21st century. By the early 2020s, the lawsuits had multiplied. Importers, trade associations, and entire industries were challenging Trump's tariffs in US courts. The legal question sharpened. Did Section 232 give the president absolute power to act, or did it require limits, oversight, and justification? In American Institute for International Steel versus United States, plaintiffs argued that Section 232 itself was unconstitutional. Their claim, Congress had handed the president an unchecked blank check, violating the separation of powers. The courts wrestled with it. Some judges said this law is broad, but Congress intended it. Others warned this is dangerous. Presidents can now weaponize national security for anything.
The Supreme Court, it declined to take the case, leaving a gray zone, a silence that only deepened the tension. Think about the precedent. If Section 232 stands as Trump used it, any president could declare virtually anything a threat. French wine, Japanese cars, Mexican avocados, all in the name of national security. That's not just economic power, that's the power to shape the global system on a whim. And this isn't abstract. Under Biden, many of Trump's tariffs stayed in place. Some were modified, others softened, but the structure remained. Which means courts aren't just ruling on Trump's trade war, they're ruling on the future of executive authority itself. And the next decision could determine whether America's trade policy belongs to Congress or to the president alone. Zoom out again. Globally, Trump's tariffs triggered a chain reaction. China didn't fold. Instead, it doubled down, expanding trade ties with Europe, Africa, and Asia. Beijing launched initiatives to bypass US markets, strengthening its Belt and Road. Europe, stung by tariffs, began talking openly about strategic autonomy.
a polite way of saying it could no longer rely on Washington's goodwill. Canada and Mexico, America's closest neighbors, renegotiated NAFTA under pressure, creating USMCA. But even there, bitterness lingered. The question became, if America's own courts rule its tariffs illegal, how do allies trust Washington's word in future deals? Every treaty, every negotiation, every tariff, all overshadowed by doubt. Did the US government act within the law or outside it? Inside America, the politics grew just as messy. Trump supporters cheered the tariff as a bold strike against China and globalization. They saw legal challenges as sabotage by elites. Opponents saw it differently. They argued Trump had abused a Cold War law to score political points, hurting farmers, manufacturers, and consumers in the process.
And hovering over it all was a deeper anxiety. What if courts proved the critics right? What if the trade war had been not only costly, but unlawful? For Trump's legacy, the stakes were existential. Was he the president who defended American workers, or the president whose signature economic policy collapsed in court? That verdict could define how history remembers him. So what happens next? Let's break it down. Scenario 1. Courts strike down more tariffs. If federal courts continue to invalidate Trump-era tariffs, the precedent becomes clear. The executive branch cannot stretch Section 232 indefinitely. Future presidents, Republican or Democrat, will face stricter judicial review, and Congress may be forced to rewrite the law. Scenario 2. Courts uphold broad powers. If higher courts side with the White House, Section 232 becomes a near blank check. Future presidents, Republican or Democrat, can use national security as a shield for economic nationalism. That could trigger endless trade wars not just with rivals like China, but even with allies. Scenario 3. Congress finally reclaims power. Faced with growing backlash, Congress could amend Section 232, tightening definitions, requiring congressional approval for certain tariffs, or limiting how long they can last. That would restore legislative authority, but risk political deadlock in moments of genuine crisis. Each path carries risk. Each path reshapes not just trade, but the Constitution itself.
At the core, this is bigger than Trump, bigger than tariffs, bigger than steel or soybeans. This is about the Constitution, the separation of powers, the very question of whether America still functions under checks and balances, or whether emergency powers have become permanent ones. And history is clear. Every time power concentrates in one branch, the balance tilts. Sometimes it tilts quietly. Sometimes it tilts with a crash. Trump's trade war pushed that balance to the edge. Courts now face the choice to pull it back or let it tip, and the consequences could echo for generations. So let's return to the beginning. It began as a trade war. It might end as a constitutional crisis. If America's courts ultimately strike down Trump's tariffs as illegal, it won't just be about economics. It will be about power, about who decides, about whether the presidency can bypass Congress and rewrite the rules of trade at will. And if they don't, if courts allow it, then every future president inherits a weapon, one that can be turned not only against rivals abroad, but against allies, industries, and the very balance of democracy itself. That's why this story matters, because hidden inside a debate over tariffs is the deeper question of America's future. Will the law restrain power, or will power rewrite the law? And that's the verdict still waiting to be delivered.